So I see a lot of familiar faces, but also some folks that I haven't seen before. So for those of you not super familiar with IARPC, IARPC stands for the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. We are part of the National Science and Technology Council, and we sit within the White House. And our task is to enhance research in the Arctic, both by bringing together federal agencies to coordinate work and by facilitating conversations among federal agencies, researchers, Arctic communities, and others who live and work in the Arctic. So we bring together leaders from 16 agencies and departments and offices across the US federal government. And we also run IARPC collaborations, which helps all of these different groups work together. So one of our key activities is the Arctic Research Plan. So every 5 years, IARPC creates a new research plan in consultation with the Arctic Research Commission, the state of Alaska, residents of the Arctic, the private sector, and public interest groups. And the plan identifies critical areas where US Arctic research supports policy from community to global scales. And it also looks for areas where federal investment can be enhanced through interagency collaboration. So the plan aims to advance knowledge and decision support for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. And it's implemented in part through our website, IARPC Collaborations. And if you don't already have a membership there, I definitely encourage you to sign up at iarpccollaborations.org. And so as many of you know, we just transitioned to a brand new Arctic Research Plan. That's the cover of it on the slide here. That's the Arctic Research Plan 2022 through 2026. And information there is available on our website at iarpccollaborations.org/plan. And as we were moving toward launching this new Arctic Research Plan, we also wanted to take the opportunity to reflect on the past Arctic Research Plan, which focused on 2017 through 2021.
Liz, sorry to break in, but you're not sharing your slides.
I'm not. That's so embarrassing. Sorry, everyone. You'll now be able to see things. Ta-da! All right, sorry about that. Well, they were very pretty pictures on the slides. I'm sorry you all missed them, but now you're gonna get them. So as I was saying, we're taking some time to reflect on the 2017 through 2021 plan. And to do that, we put together, or I should say, Max Showalter, Knaus Fellow, put together a end of plan report. And that serves as the biennial report to Congress that we have to put out every 2 years. But it also does a lot more in that it shows the true breadth and depth of projects that are connected to IARPC. So it's coming out later this month. And to write the report, we reached out to the collaboration teams and agencies working with IARPC and asked for 1 or 2 sentences on what groups thought their best, most exciting achievements were. And we got over 60 pages of responses. So IARPC and our community has been doing a lot over the last 5 years. So what's included in the report that's coming out is just a fraction of those 60 pages. And then those 60 pages themselves are also just a subset of the total influence and work that IARPC has had over the past 5 years. And the report is broken into 4 chapters. So you can see them here on the screen: improved collaborations, observations of the Arctic, modeling the future Arctic, and applying research for human need. And today you're going to hear from several researchers speaking to projects about applying research to human needs. And before I introduce the speakers, I do want to frame that much of the work of the most recent Arctic Research Plan was facilitated through IARPC Collaborations, so our online platform, and that's part of the first chapter of the report. And in the period of this last Arctic Research Plan, 2017 through 2021, we saw a huge influx in the number of works using IARPC Collaborations to work together. There's a more than 200% increase in the membership on the platform. And so, we have the federal agencies working together, and that's a large part of what IARPC does. Like the proverbial iceberg, there is a lot more happening beneath the surface. So for example, by the end of that plan, about 75% of the membership of IARPC Collaborations was non-federal. So that's really just how much IARPC was bringing together different groups. And that website brings together the federal part of IARPC with non-federal researchers and other Arctic community members. And you can kind of think of it as a conference center, an online forum, an event calendar, all rolled into one. And it's free and open to anyone who can contribute, so regardless of what your role is in Arctic research. There are now more than 3,000 members of the Arctic research community. And as I said, I definitely encourage you to sign up if you don't already have an account. So much of the work you'll hear about today and in our other webinars in this series has benefited from the use of that platform and from the convening ability that IARPC has. So you're going to hear from 3 speakers today, some of whom will explicitly touch on this. So now to our speakers. Today we will hear from 3 speakers. Each one will speak for about 10 minutes, and then afterwards we'll have a group Q&A period. So we're not going to plan on taking questions between speakers, but please feel free to put questions in the chat at any time and we'll hold on to them. So we have Kevin Bjella, who is Research Civil Engineer at CREL, the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab. We've got Darcy Peter, who's a Research Assistant at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and Olivia Lee, Program Director at the National Science Foundation. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my slides and give Kevin an opportunity to share his.
Okay, welcome everybody. Can you see my slides very well? Are they full size?
We're seeing your presenter view. So we see the current slide and the next slide.
Oh, let's see. Let me try that again. Okay, how about that?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody. Thank you, Liz. And thank you for attending this, this workshop to hear about some of the work that we've all been doing. I'm going to particularly emphasize some work that was a partnership between the University of Alaska Fairbanks, CREL, the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab, which I'm a part of, which is part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and also the Alaska District of the Army Corps of Engineers participated in this study as well. What this was a culmination of a few studies starting way back in 2003, understanding that some communities in Alaska are under threat due to environmental changing conditions. So there was a baseline study that was done in 2003, and then a further baseline study that was done in 2009, specifically for flood and erosion. And that was conducted by, it was federally funded and conducted by the Alaska District of the Corps of Engineers. And there were specifically 9 communities that were pointed out in that study, mostly in relation to the West Coast. And so this was a follow-on study to that. It was the waning years of the last term of the Obama presidency. When he visited Alaska, he was able to take a trip to Kotzebue, and he was informed of some of the conditions, some of the issues that are occurring, like in Shishmaref and Newtok, Kivalina, so forth. And so money was made available and provided to the Denali Commission, which is located here in Alaska. For those of you that might not know, the Denali Commission was set up by former Senator Ted Stevens as a way to facilitate federal monies to the villages, primarily for infrastructure projects, energy, water, wastewater. But this was a great way for the federal government to step in and do a little bit of interjection and get things moving as far as new environmental threats. So we were tasked, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Billy Connor, leading a group of Dr. Misha Karnevsky and Dr. Bill Snobble, in conjunction with CREL, to look at the permafrost portion of 3 combined threats. We have coastal erosion, which the Alaska District was looking at again, riverine erosion, river erosion and flooding. And again, that was the Alaska District that was looking at that. And then the permafrost threat. So these 3 combined threats that were combined into this one report. And so I'm going to quickly talk about the permafrost aspect. So I'm sorry, I should have advanced to this slide earlier, but I pretty much went through all of this already. But this was all really based off of the 2003 and 2009 baseline erosion assessment. So we were carrying on from that. primarily, what I want to state up front, this was only a desktop analysis. We did not have the funding. Funding was not provided for follow-on boots on the ground studies at each of the 187 villages. We took a look at all the lists of the villages across the state, and it boiled down to 187 communities that people actually live on a recurring basis. And we also only looked at public infrastructure. We did not look at what the private homes or businesses, any businesses that might be in these communities might be occurring. We analyzed for current ambient temperatures. We took a forward look for what climate conditions might be, but this was based on what the current conditions are. One of our conclusions, which is probably not new to those that are familiar with permafrost, is that in comparison to coastal erosion and riverine erosion, permafrost thaw settlement is not a catastrophic environmental threat. Now, coastal erosion and river flooding is a catastrophic event, potentially catastrophic. Most of what we found is the larger infrastructure, public infrastructure at the larger communities is generally better constructed and is more well suited to be robust for the climate change, what we map to be potential changes for decades to come with degrading permafrost. A few of the findings, unfortunately, our available permafrost maps are low resolution. Technical information for a lot of the smaller villages is either very low or non-existent. We did a survey to all the communities to provide their information, their observations, pictures, so forth. We had less than a 5% return on that. The best information that we really could get was from satellite images, and then our subject matter experts knowing conditions on the ground and what features, surface features might be telling us, trails, inundated trails with water, degradation, river cuts, things like that, that we could use to give us a clue of what's going on. And in the end, we really don't have a good handle on what a lot of the infrastructure resiliency is for the upcoming climate change. So our analysis algorithm was any existing data, photos, and then team knowledge. So just a quick background, Alaska's, all permafrost terrains are broken up into either continuous, discontinuous, or sporadic. Alaska happens to have all three. Colder to the north, of course, more continuous. It's everywhere. It's very cold. And it's thick, 1,000 feet thick or so, 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. But as you get towards Fairbanks, in between the Alaska Range and the Brooks Range, it's warmer. It's near freezing temperatures. It's discontinuous. It's much thinner. And then when you get to Anchorage, it's non-existent. We break it down into two categories. Generally what we call ice poor, which is frozen alluvials, the gravels. They have very little ice content in them, even though they were river gravels. And so therefore they're not much of a threat when they thaw. Then there's the silts and the finer grained materials that were deposited either lake bottoms or by wind processes. This is called yedema. It's a Russian term, very ice rich, and many hundreds of percent more moisture than the soil. And when it thaws, that's what becomes the problem. So we have what we call thaw stable at the top there and thaw unstable in the picture down below. And this is a quick picture just to illustrate. There's a core of frozen material on the left, in the picture on the left. And when it thaws, it's over 50% water, this particular core. And that's yedema material from the Fairbanks area. So you build infrastructure on this, or the environment starts to thaw the ground. And that's the type of bearing capacity that you have, whether it be a building or a road or an airfield. And here's a map that we used. This is actually created by Misha Karnevsky and others. But this is a map of Yedema across the state of Alaska. And this provides just kind of a quantitative, high altitude look at where the fine-grained ice-rich materials might be. And so we utilize this in our desktop analysis. But to kind of get down into the nuts and bolts of really what we did, it was kind of a complex rubric that started with this here, which we looked at Group A, which was existing permafrost related problems. And then Group B, where by looking forward, again, at subject matter expert knowledge of what might be occurring, what we have seen occur at other places, what might be the future risk. So as you go down through A and B, there was the factors of 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, which rated it from either no problems to all the way to an extreme hazard. And then we based a score for the individual structures. So like you see there, A2A are structures that include the schools and power plants and so forth. A2B would then be the more distributive type of infrastructure like water and sewer lines. And then A2C is transportation, roads and airports. So we did this for as much as we could from aerial photographs and quantified what we thought we saw for each village. And then we also gathered just specific information. So this table here shows that we looked at a particular village like Ambler, and we started gathering information that we just knew straight away, either from reports that we were getting, engineering reports from infrastructure, or academic reports from research, and we just tried to quantify, excuse me, as much of the data that was out there as possible. Again, oftentimes there was very little. And here's our flow chart for how we worked through the level of the risk of permafrost degradation on the B side to get from no risk all the way down to the highest level of risk. And then we put into a scoring metric based on permafrost criteria for low, medium, or high for 8 different categories. And here on the left, I'm only showing 4 of those, but the criteria are listed in that table in the upper right. So we wanted to make sure that we were taking into account every aspect that we could that related to the community. And so that's why we ended up with these 8 different criteria. And then, so within each of those criteria, excuse me, we were able to come up with a score based on low, medium, or high impact. And this was based on the table on the right. Again, like I said, this is kind of a complex rubric. Time until damage, and then our confidence that in the time interval until damage occurred. So there was, again, there was a lot of subjectiveness to this, but it was in an effort to try to start to quantify what communities might be at higher risk than others. Then the end result was everything was compiled in this table, and we were given a score for low, medium, or high based on each criteria, and then the confidence interval. And then the total weighted score was stacked against, I shouldn't say stacked, that's not the right term. It was tabularized against all the communities. The one thing we were very concerned about was that the end result is this would be politicized. That unfortunately one community might feel like another community was termed in worse conditions, and so therefore might be, if federal funding or state funding became available, that they might be that other community might be at a better position for the funding than another community. And that was not the case. We were not trying to put this in any type of rack and stack order. It was just really to try to understand where's the highlights of concern, and what can be done to start to address how much needs to be allocated to start to address some of these issues, and what regions of the state it needs to be applied to, not necessarily on a competition level between the communities. The one thing that we can say for sure is one area that really stuck out for us from the permafrost thaw susceptibility is the YK Delta. And I don't think this is a big surprise to anybody that is knowledgeable of the area, but it's very warm permafrost. It's very ice rich, and they're seeing dramatic changes due to the changing climate, the warming climate. And so places like Bethel, of course, are seeing some high rates of permafrost degradation. And then it's based on whether they're on the coast in some areas. But again, more specific data is needed to actually quantify for those areas. We weren't able to get on the ground and get, say, saline content of the permafrost, which is so important. And so really to be able to make a more qualitative assessment of these locations, the next step is for a boots on the ground analysis for each community. So I think, excuse me. So our conclusions, the Yetama belts and what I pointed out on that previous map, and then the YK Delta, those are the highest risk areas. There definitely was a correlation when we compared to the flooding criteria provided by, or the flooding risk provided by the Alaska District and the erosion risk provided by the Alaska District. I would leave that for another presentation, or let the viewer just read the report. We need a system to compile all of this information. And so that would be another step for funding, is to get this into a GIS format and start to compile this on the state level. Any consultant data that's available, there should be some mechanism to start making that information public content. And that's a difficult one, because a lot of consultants, engineering consultants and so forth, they don't want that information to be publicly available. So, but it was very hard to find information for these communities. And we also need permafrost temperature data needed, and future forecasts for permafrost temperature, which I could say we have a project going on now to work on that with the Alaska University of Alaska Fairbanks, but that's for another presentation. So I think that's all I have at this point. Yep. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I hope if everyone can join in a virtual round of applause while Darcy gets her slides going. And also, we will have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions for Kevin, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll hold on to them for then. Till then. And Darcy, go right ahead.
Thanks so much, Von Quincy. Good morning, everybody. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, great. So my name's Darcy Peter. I am Koyukon and Gwich'in Athabaskan from Beaver, Alaska. I work for Woodwell Climate Research Center as a scientist there, and today I'll be going over guiding principles for working in northern communities and how Arctic researchers and indigenous communities can work together to combat global climate change. So before I get started too far, I do want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional land of the Dena'ina people, the lower Tanana River, currently known as North Pole, Alaska. So this document itself was created in 2020. I worked with a bunch of my colleagues, and it took about 6 months. So this document in full is about 21 pages, but I'll just be going over the guiding principles themselves. In reality, it is a much longer document. It has resources, decolonization, land acknowledgement workshop information, stuff like that. But as I said, I'll just be going over each individual guiding principle for now for researchers who want to work in northern environments. So the first one is not really a guiding principle itself. It's more of the ultimate principle. So I think it's more important than to be on a list. And that's that respect is at the heart of all northern cultures. So researchers should, in reality, be super open to listening to a different way of life, different languages, norms, cultural practices, things like that. We are a very knowledgeable people, and respect is at the heart of each culture that is in the North. So just keep that in mind moving forward as I go through all of the principles. So the first one here is pretty simple. If there's other guiding principles, follow those ones in each respective community that you plan on doing research on. Don't break the law, pretty self-explanatory. Guiding principle number 2 is to maintain communication with all important entities. So for example, if I were to want to do a project in Bethel, Alaska, I would contact the Native Regional Nonprofit Consortium, which there is AVCP, the Association of Village Council Presidents. I would contact the state of Alaska, who has a hub there. I would contact Bethel Native Corporation, the Bethel Community Services Foundation, and the Orotsamu Native Council, which is the tribe. So you can see that in one community, there can be a plethora of different entities that are super knowledgeable and should know what kind of research you're doing and what's going on. This just allows for a lot of transparency, especially if it's a multi-year grant. The third guiding principle is to familiarize yourselves as researchers with local cultures, land ownership and use, any relevant historical events, and all entities before actually traveling there. Especially if this is a longer term project and you wanna, build a project outside of your initial one. If you're going to keep going back to a community, you can't really understand its people or relate with the indigenous people there if you don't understand the history of that place. So it takes a little bit of additional research to familiarize yourself with, like I said, the cultures, the language, and the land use and ownership of each place that you're going to. Guiding principle number 4 is to incorporate travel support in your research proposal to attend relevant state and local conferences and workshops. Yes, to share your research, but also to network with appropriate entities and build relationships with people who might be interested in your research, who you can partner with moving forward. I myself like going to the American Geophysical Union and COP, the bigger international conferences, but it's also very, very important to go to the smaller local ones also so that everybody knows what you're doing and you can network. It's just a great way to meet people and to get your research out there. Guiding principle number 5 is to take into account traditional knowledge at all stages of your research. This is in the proposal writing, in the research processes, all the different forms. This is really highly encouraged because this is the greatest data set in the world. Indigenous people have lived on their land since time immemorial, since before time existed. So it's only right that you should incorporate their knowledge into your Western research, if that makes sense. So you should be working with Indigenous people, developing research questions with Indigenous people instead of on them or beside them. They should not be an afterthought. They should be incorporated at every stage into the research process. Number 6 is also more of a technical one. You should provide financial compensation to locals, elders, youth, anybody who allocates any time, energy, input, or contributions made into the research project. Much like you would pay a partner if they contributed to your research, you should also do that for Indigenous people in their sharing of traditional knowledge if they do so. Guiding principle number 7 is to give the appropriate credit and recognition to Indigenous people who contribute to your research. This goes beyond just, the published paper that you have. This is more in publications and presentations, at poster sessions and conversations. This is also just a huge form of respect. Number 8 is one that isn't really talked about often, but I think is really important if you want to work in northern communities. It's to guarantee confidentiality of any surveys, interviews, or sensitive material. And this can be on the record or off the record. It can be in the field. It can be over a dinner table at a more formal setting like a conference, or just, sitting in the field and like having a conversation with somebody. If you plan on using something that somebody says in any realm, just please ask the person who shared that information first if they're comfortable with that, and then give appropriate credit afterwards. Guiding principle number 9 is to communicate the ongoing and final research objectives, methods, findings, and their interpretation to local communities in a language that's easily understood and applicable. This one goes well beyond just publishing a paper and sending a copy to the tribe and all those entities that you should have reached out to by now. This is allocating time to have a community meeting to, yes, like let people know why you're there and how long you're going to be there, what the project is, things like that, but also to listen. And this goes back to the other guiding principle about, you know, applying Indigenous knowledge into your research. So this goes beyond just a published paper. Like I said, you need to have a community meeting, get people together, eat food with them, build that relationship. That's one way to communicate your research. Another way is to have a newsletter that's very picture heavy, have captions of the pictures, and share it out in a language that's easily understood, that isn't high in, you know, science lingo and data and stuff like this. It should be very simple and easy to understand. Something else to note here is that language might not be the main spoken language. Sorry, is that English might not be the main spoken language in the community that you're working in. So if that is a factor, then you should look into hiring a translator. And you should, by this point, hopefully have a lot of people in your back pocket who might be able to help with that. Guiding principle number 10 is to ensure that the research itself is not exploitative of any traditional or sacred land, its resources, or its inhabitants. As I said, Indigenous people are very tied to the land. We've lived there for a long time. We're stewards of the land. We're in constant relationship with place. So just please ensure that what you're doing isn't harmful to, you know, to the environment itself or to the people who live there, or the resources that the land harbors. And the final one is to use an Indigenous land acknowledgement at the beginning of presentations and meetings. And this just is a way to present yourself as an ally to Indigenous people and all people of color and underrepresented people who might be at any given presentation. And this goes well beyond just a sentence at the beginning. I can talk about land acknowledgements all day, but I think that this should just be a good starting point at looking at the research you're doing and why you think a land acknowledgement is important. And hopefully we'll start a bigger conversation within your organization and hopefully your research partners as well. I know we're pretty short on time, but in summation, being a researcher is so much more than just doing the science, getting the data, publishing a paper and calling it good. It's talking on local radio stations, it's talking with locals, incorporating traditional knowledge into your Western science. It's teaching the next generation of Arctic scientists, getting Indigenous community members into the research itself, whether it's an elder, a youth, a high schooler, a tribal member, anybody. Involve them in your research as much as possible and give them enough credit. And then finally, also engaging with policymakers is of the utmost importance for scientists, because what good is science if it only benefits other scientists and doesn't eventually get down to people who live off the land and who are experiencing climate change at 3 times the rate as the rest of the world. So with that, there's my email address. I can drop it in the chat as well if you'd like a copy of the full 21-page guiding principles document. And with that, I'll say Masicho, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Darcy, for a really great presentation. And I really appreciate the point that research is about more than just collecting data. I think it's a good reminder for all of us. And I would definitely appreciate the link to the report. So I will now hand it to Olivia Lee, who will be speaking about sea ice for Walrus Outlook. And Olivia, I see your slides.
Great. Everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. In case there's any confusion in branding, I'm a researcher at the International Arctic Research Center, but I'm on detail at the National Science Foundation, where I'm a program manager at the moment as well. So my presentation is on a project that I've been involved with for, gosh, this will be my 10th season. It's a Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook. And when I got started in this project, I didn't really know what it was. I don't know what is going on with my presentation slides here. I cannot advance. Okay, I didn't really know what it was about. So another problem with branding, the Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook often gets confused with the Sea Ice Outlook, but we do something a little bit different. It's a collaboration, and the list of partners are on the logos below. It's managed primarily through the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States with funding from the National Science Foundation. NOAA's National Weather Service plays a key role in providing weather forecast information and sea ice forecast information for the communities in the Bering Strait region. And researchers at IARC, International Arctic Research Center at University of Alaska Fairbanks, have been helping to keep some of these collaborations going. And we also partner with the Eskimo Walrus Commission on issues which I'll bring up later on in the presentation. So here is kind of a snapshot of what the Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook does during the spring forecast season. The National Weather Service provides satellite imagery and maps, forecasts of wind conditions, weather, sea ice conditions. And we include that with local observations from our community partners who are based along the Bering Strait region and St. Lawrence Island. And what's really interesting is that this fairly long-term community-focused observing program is along a very important migratory route for a lot of marine mammals who will be migrating north with the sea ice during the spring to reach rich feeding grounds in the region. And in recent years, there hasn't been consistent aerial survey for marine mammals, nor have there been a lot of tagging data. Tagging is fairly resource intensive. So I know a lot of people may not think that this is a key observing program, but I am here to try to convince you that it really is. But it didn't always look so fancy. So when we got started, we were very basic in terms of the types of information we were putting out to the communities, very basic maps showing wind directions in the key areas that are highlighted in the boxes. And our observers were not compensated. They were completely voluntary observers. And we worked with a lot of elders in the communities because they just happened to be who we had established collaborations with. And we also included observations from researchers, like Rolf Gredinger, who is, some of you might know, was a former researcher at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we still struggle with how best to present information to communities as part of the Outlook, because we want to provide valuable information, but also being aware of the bandwidth limitations for accessing really large files or imagery. And we tried several different ways to try to get information across, and it's been maintained for over a decade now, so we think we're doing something right. I want to acknowledge our current collaborators here at the 7 communities along the Bering Strait region. Over time, Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook has evolved, so we no longer collaborate only with elders, but now we have observers who are more active hunters and are going out and really being affected by the changes in weather and ocean conditions and how variable it is from year to year. Now that we've been doing this for a while, we can also track changes over time. And as a general trend, we're starting our outlooks a little earlier in the season in order to give the hunters the most relevant up-to-date information when they are out hunting. And we had been ending our outlooks earlier as well, because the ice tended to go out much earlier in the year compared to when we first started doing the Outlook. The last couple of years were exceptions. It's not always a trend that all communities will get to hunt during the entire spring season. There are some communities like Shishmaref where we keep the Outlook going because their ability to access the water is hampered by coastal ice conditions. So I also wanted to bring up that we have a very active community on Facebook. And that's probably where we get our most engagement with people who are not scientists or likely to go to the Outlook's website on the ARPC webpage. And over time, we've started to get our observers helping us identify changing wildlife dynamics. For instance, through the US Fish and Wildlife Service harvest statistics, we've noticed that there's been a trend of more male walruses being harvested compared to females and calves. Again, there's very much interannual variability, but there are questions about where are the females with calves going on years where the ice goes out much earlier in the season. There's a picture here from Clarence Irigu Jr. in Gamble of a ribbon seal. They used to be fairly consistently observed as marking the tail end of the migration. So the walruses and other seals will migrate north first. And typically when you see the ribbon seals, that means that that's kind of the tail end of the hunting season. And for a while, other traditional Western science methods of tracking migrations in the strait hadn't had as much luck locating ribbon seals. So we had no idea where the ribbon seals were going. So having our community observers provide information on changing wildlife dynamics, bringing up new questions that we need to develop research questions about, has been really, really valuable. But I also wanted to highlight that, it's not a research program developed to answer a specific problem per se. The fact that our community observers are active hunters, harvesters, is an important part of what kinds of information are being shared. We don't have a standard reporting form or procedures. We ask all of our community collaborators to just present whatever information they feel is most important to share. We also encourage them to use Indigenous language terms because if it is more descriptive for the ice conditions. And so we get a lot of information that's related to boating, hunting. And in this example on a Facebook post from Opik Akinga in Diomede related to conditions that were affecting crabbing activity. So it's really a rich source of information. It's not easily structured. So in terms of thinking of it as data that could be processed, it would be a very messy type of data set. I wanted to bring up that there was a panel held at the Community and Citizen Science Conference, which I provide in the slides a link, which is available on the IARPC website. In case you wanted to hear from one of our observers, Douglas Johnson, who's based out of Nome, and our other collaborators from the CIS for Walrus Outlook. It's always hard to talk about these multi-collaborative research projects without giving the voice to the other people who are heavily involved in the project. But one of the questions I asked Google at that panel was, do you like the format where we are not asking you to answer, standardized set form of information, but we just give you freedom to report whatever is most relevant to you? And he said it was really helpful that they could just report what they wanted in their own words. So I know we like to try to quantify very difficult, messy amounts of information. So here are just word clouds that I put together for the last decade for the different communities. And you can see in St. Lawrence Island communities, Sibunga and Gamble walrus features very heavily in the observations, but also ice conditions and boating and hunting activities. Versus here in Shishmaref and Nome, there's a lot more linked to information about shore-fast ice conditions, whether or not there was an open lead. Walruses are still featured, but they're not as important of species during the spring hunt as much compared to other seals that they are maybe prioritizing during the spring hunt season. So the CIS for Walrus Outlook, although it has walrus in its name, is not just for walrus hunting. And then finally, a few slides on whether or not we have value to society. Again, like I mentioned, Facebook is where we get most of our engagement. We've seen growth in our usage and interest in people both in Alaska and outside of Alaska and internationally. The CIS for Walrus Outlook was used to help the Eskimo Walrus Commission petition for emergency disaster relief during the 2013 very poor walrus harvest on St. Lawrence Island. And we do a lot of outreach, not just in scientific circles, but in public media. And we also tend to field a lot of requests from people trying to do documentaries and wanting to connect with community members. Just a quick look at where in Alaska people have been engaging with our CIS for Walrus Facebook page. And when we talk about building capacity, I also wanted to emphasize that it's not just about building research capacity in the communities, but also how are we helping to train the next generation of researchers. So we also, where possible, try to provide opportunities for students to be engaged in some fashion, the CIS for Walrus Outlook. And so finally, a few thoughts on what has helped keep the CIS for Walrus Outlook going for over a decade. I think it's been helpful that it's been a flat, not hierarchical organizational structure. There's been a lot of adapting to change, both in terms of who have been involved in the communities. And it's been helpful that there's some redundancy in relationships. So if somebody moves on from a position, that there is an opportunity to keep the work going. You have to be open to innovation. We're currently piloting a new mobile app with some partners. And, you know, some of these projects, they can continue for the long term with a very low budget. I would say what that budget is, because I don't want people to think that all programs can run on such a low budget. But there's opportunities here to continue things that don't cost a lot of money, but add a lot of value. And speaking of value, we're also right now in the process of doing an evaluation project to see whether or not the community still finds the CIS for Walrus Outlook a helpful product that's worth continuing. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you, Darcy and Kevin, again. I am putting the link in the chat to where, if you are an IARPC Collaborations member, you can see the slides. So if you want to get any of the links that were included in Olivia's slides or Darcy's, or I think Kevin may have had a few links as well, you can download those slides and check out the links. We have a little less than 10 minutes for Q&A. So I invite people either to raise your hand at *9 if you're on the phone, or go ahead and put stuff in the chat. And I know I did see one question come in earlier, wondering, Aaron was wondering, Kevin, can you speak more about how you involved the community members and their knowledge of the area when you were putting your report together?
Yeah, well, like I said, we conducted a survey. We sent a survey out to all the communities. It was an online, we contacted via online and through the post, but to get people to get online and do an online survey. And that was our primary method of contacting the villages or the communities. There were a few that we actually knew of some folks that we could contact, but we didn't want to really bias the information too much and get too much information that might come from one particular source. We wanted the community to provide us as much as they could. And we thought that would be best through the surveys. Unfortunately, only 5% responded. So that was our primary engagement, really. But thanks for the question.
While we wait for additional questions in the chat or folks to raise their hand, actually, Darcy, I had a similar question for you in terms of how the principles that you, or the guiding principles that you outlined in your presentation were developed. You know, who developed them, and what did that process look like? Yeah,
thanks for the question. So it all started with a conversation with my boss, actually. I wanted, we have our own projects at Woodwell, obviously. A lot of them are based in the Arctic, and I'm Indigenous, so I, think that the research that we do should benefit Indigenous people because we're doing our research on their land. It should be applicable research. So I did a lot of research into guiding principles that already existed in the Arctic. I looked at a few that existed in New Zealand with the Maori people, and I talked with a bunch of people. I talked with Jessica Black at UAF, Melinda Chase, Liana Hefner, just a bunch of Alaska Native nonprofit people. A lot of my colleagues, my boss had a lot of insight also. I had a lot of conversations. It took a while to develop and kind of condense them into 11 guiding principles. But so it was kind of a long process, a lot of different drafts and versions. And I think it's being implemented at 2 universities right now, the guiding principles. So it's gotten quite a bit of traction over the past few years. So yeah, that's how they were developed.
Thank you so much. Catherine, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, my question is for Kevin. How do policymakers and officials who are able to provide funding to some of these communities who either have damage from permafrost already or who are at significant risk for permafrost damage, how do they make sense of the data you compiled? I think your last slide or penultimate slide had the great big list and the grid and whatnot. I would see a policymaker saying, wow, that's a lot of data. I've got money to give to some communities. How do I sort that out and use my money to the best effect?
Yeah, really good question. And we talked about this quite a bit. Unfortunately, it's not at that level. The amount of funding that's available to help these communities is not really at a point where it's a let's look at the list and let's pick the top 10, so to speak. It's the catastrophic communities that are getting the attention right now. The moving of Newtok to McTarvik, Shishmaref, Kivalina, those are the ones that are really rising high on the radar right now, and they're the ones that are getting what little funding is available. So unfortunately, our assessment really probably hasn't played into effect that much on the funding stream yet. What we really hope is that it'll be the first step in a boots on the ground study, and then that boots on the ground study, hopefully there'll be money, follow-on money, and that ranking of risk will then be a barometer for which communities get funding first. So
Great,
I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Kevin. We've got a question in the chat from Betsy for Olivia. Are there any plans to extend the Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook project to Russian hunters and collaborators?
Yeah, we would love to do that. We haven't yet been able to get all of our Bering Strait communities in the same room because of COVID yet. That is our #1 priority, is to finally get everyone in the same room. But I think that there would be great value in having it extended. We just haven't figured out how to do it yet.
I have time for one more question if anyone wants to raise their hand and throw something out there.
I have one more for Kevin. That's okay. Yeah. Kevin, you mentioned that you could use more data. Is there a list of the types of data and what these data gaps are that you could share with people who are collecting observations?
I probably would have to confer for exact consensus on this from the team, but what I would say is better geotechnical data. Because what we were asked to assess was the risk for permafrost degradation, and you really can't assess that without knowing the ground ice condition. And you need to know the permafrost temperature condition, you need to know the salinity. And so really a geotechnical evaluation, boots on the ground, then also the boots on the ground would assess the type of infrastructure that's at the villages, at the communities, and how well was that infrastructure built. Because they could be experiencing quite a bit of permafrost degradation, but the structures could be built to withstand that to some degree. So that would offset some risk. So yeah, that's really the kind of data we need, is that geotechnical information. And unfortunately, it's not easy to get. You need a drill rig, or you need some way to be able to subsurface sample, and then you got to process that. So it would take money. It would take time and money. So yeah, thank you. Good questions.
We're just about at the top of the hour. So I do want to let folks know that we do have one more webinar coming up. The exact date is to be determined, but toward the end of February, we'll have a webinar on modeling accomplishments in the last 5 years. So stay tuned for information about that. I will once again remind people that you can sign up for an IARPC collaborations account, and that'll help you keep an eye on when that webinar will be. And finally, I want to give a huge thanks to Darcy, Olivia, and Kevin for presenting. Really appreciate you taking the time to present today, as well as all the work you've put in over the last few years or more in Arctic research. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. That was great.